It's Tuesday, January 17th, 2017, but this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, the weekly draft podcast, often talking about the Seahawks, usually talking about their season. That's over. So without the Seahawks season being over, we can talk about the four teams that are still alive for the Super Bowl win. We can talk about what's going on with some of these college prospects going into the draft, declaring for the NFL draft, as well as the Seahawks draft needs, and the opening for the San Francisco 49ers head coach and GM positions as they interview Seattle Seahawk people for both of those jobs, including Tom Cable, Trent Kirchner, and Scott Fitterer. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and we can talk about some of the players that the Seahawks can target in the 2017 NFL draft, including offensive linemen, which is the hot topic, I think, du jour for a lot of people talking about the Seahawks offensive line, as it usually is. I'm Kenneth Arthur with Field Goals, and with me, as always, is Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Rob, the Seahawks lost 36-20 to the Atlanta Falcons. I think it was a little bit of a bigger blowout than any of us had expected. The Seahawks, regardless of, say, review on the Luke Wilson play or whatever, we're down 16 points with less than 3 minutes to go. They would have needed 2 touchdowns, 2 2-point conversions, an onside kick. Certainly would have not liked to see the wrong call out there and give the Seahawks a little bit of a hope. And but I don't think that the classy thing to do or the right thing to do is to talk about officiating, especially when you are, just getting picked apart pretty much for the most part by Matt Ryan and not being able to do anything of note really on offense. So the Seahawks definitely lost this game, and had they advanced for any reason, probably would have lost to the Green Bay Packers, if not the New England Patriots or Pittsburgh Steelers, whoever will be there when they are there. Rob, what were your thoughts on the Seahawks against the Atlanta Falcons, and especially with the offensive line and Pete Carroll, saying in his press conference, sort of putting a pin on it and just saying no, I'm happy with Darrell Bevell. I'm happy with Tom Cable. I'm happy with the players that we have on the offensive line. We're going to challenge them with some competition. But if, basically saying if these are the 5 guys that we are going with right now, what were your thoughts on that?
Okay, a lot to get into there. So first of all, was not surprised with the game in Atlanta. It kind of felt like an inevitable conclusion to this season. The Seahawks have been sort of trending this way. They've been very inconsistent to end the year. They've been winning a game and looking good doing it, and then losing in horrible fashion the following week. So it was just a continuation of that. The Seahawks did not deserve to win in Atlanta. I also think that maybe sort of down inside, Pete Carroll knew that this was coming. It kind of feels like they've been trying to push through a lot of issues for a number of weeks now, maybe even the whole season, and that it just wasn't going to be Seattle's year. The injuries to Russell Wilson, the injuries to Thomas Rawls and CJ Procise, they were without Cam Chancellor for most of the first half of the season, or it felt that way. And then as soon as they get him back, Michael Bennett gets injured. And then as soon as he starts to come back, Thomas breaks his leg. They never had all of their key talent on defense together. It's pretty clear that the defense was just missing a little bit of snap in the back end this year. Pete Carroll has referenced the need to focus on the secondary in the draft. And, I'm sure that's something we'll come on to a little bit later. But I genuinely think that that's where the need areas are now. It's on the defense. It's about getting that defense back to a formidable level. I think this is the draft to do it. It's very much heavily awaited towards the defense in this draft. So there's an opportunity to get better there and just to, get healthy and come back again next year. The Seahawks have not turned into a bad team. They're still a 10-win team this year. If they hadn't drawn the game in Arizona, if Stephen Hauschka kicks the damn thing through the posts, it would have been an 11-win season. If they don't blow the end of the other Arizona game, it could have been an 11-win season. So, it was still a pretty good year given everything that they faced. And I think over time, that's how we'll come to see it. There's disappointment immediately after the Atlanta game for the reasons for the manner of the defeat rather, and the scoreline was bad in Arizona. But I think over time we'll come to think, actually, do you know what? It was never going to be Seattle's year. The injuries and everything just hampered them. They got away from their identity on offense. But I think they've got a chance to sort of grow through this now. Like I said, hopefully they'll be healthier next year. I think there'll be a recommitment to the run on offense and more of a balance between the run and the pass next year. Russell Wilson will hopefully be 100%. And they're going to get some really nice players in the draft for defense. On to sort of Tom Cable, just as we were starting this podcast, Kenny, it was announced via his agent, Doug Henrickson, that he was going to be staying in Seattle, that he was not going to be becoming the 49ers head coach. It appears that they're focused on appointing Kyle Shanahan. I think it's a good thing. I know a lot of people out there don't like Darrell Bevell. I think a lot of people look at him as an obvious scapegoat. It's frequent that teams point towards the offensive coordinator, especially if they like the head coach, and that is Pete Carroll's very popular. So they will look to coordinators to point the finger of blame. I think that Darrell Bevell's done a very good job over the years. I know this year's, as we've just talked about, there's been some issues on the offense, especially with injuries. But prior to that, they were consistently a top 10 offense per DVOA. Yes, the end of that Super Bowl will always go down in history as one of the toughest play calls to handle because of the situation. And yet the players didn't execute that play, and it was a good play by New England that often gets forgotten in that situation. So I had no issue with Darrell Bevell coming back. I expected it. Tom Cable, I know a lot of people want to rag on the offensive line and the job that Tom Cable has done. I would challenge any offensive line coach in the NFL to produce even an average product with an undrafted free agent rookie left tackle, a first-year starting left guard, a first-year starter at center, a rookie right guard, and a second-year starter at right tackle mixed in with Bradley Sowell, who was just a journeyman tackle they signed. That is not a formula for success. So I think it's very harsh to judge Tom Cable based on the product that we saw this year. The final point of this is you referenced there Pete Carroll saying they're going to go with the guys they've got. Well, for the most part, I think that's understandable because I don't think they're going to replace Jermaine Ifedi. He's a first-round pick. Justin Britt played well. Mark Glowinski, a lot of people would argue was their second best defensive lineman this year. Maybe there'll be some competition for him, but no real reason, in my opinion, to feel like you've got to aggressively upgrade there. It's the tackle positions. Now, they seem to have a lot of faith in George Fant and believe that he has got the potential to become a really good player. They felt that way in the past about Alvin Bailey and Gary Gilliam and have had to sort of change their mind down the line. So we will see if George Fant can avoid regressing in the offseason and can actually deliver on the potential that the Seahawks clearly believe he has. Gilliam, I think, ended the year playing better than he did at the start. I think we saw some improvements from him. I expect him to be back next year. But I also think that they will add some competition at tackle, and Carroll mentioned this. I don't think they're going to go out and spend $10 million on Ricky Wagner. But if they get to the free agency period and there's a player maybe for $6 or $7 million, or if it's a pretty good player they can get at a decent price, then I would expect they would do that. I think they will look at the trade market and see if there's a veteran offensive tackle they could bring in to either play left or right tackle, probably right tackle. And I think they will look in the draft. And, I know that this is not a great first round for offensive tackles. There's Garrett Bowles, who I love. There's Ryan Ramczyk, who's pretty good. I don't think Cam Robinson will be a target for them. I don't think he's going to go in the first round. But there's also a collection of young tackles that could be available in sort of rounds 3 or 4. And I know that people are going to cringe at that, and they're going to want to see a more aggressive approach towards the offensive line. But there is some talent there. And, Ricky Wagner was a 5th-round pick, and someone's going to spend $10 million a year on him in this offseason by the looks of things. So there's people like Adam Bisnavati. There is people like Chad Wheeler. There are others that you could list as well. Dion Dawkins at Temple. There are quite a few potential tackle prospects in this draft that you could get in the middle rounds, get some value with. So, I do expect them to add to the offensive line, and I think, fingers crossed, it will improve with more experience as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the Seahawks, sort of where they're going to be picking at. They're picking 26th overall. It's the same place where they were in 2000. Well, I think that's where they were when they traded down in 2014. Or no, that couldn't have been right. Anyway, James Carpenter was 25th overall. Jermaine Ifedi, that was, I think, when they traded down from 26 to 31. And
they had the 26th pick last year as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there you go. And it's interesting too when you talk about the way the Seahawks. This is a team, the Seattle Seahawks, the ones that have been to the playoffs in second round in each of the last 5 years. The only two teams in the NFL who've even been to the playoffs in each of the last 5 years are the Patriots and the Seahawks. A very successful team. This is a team that has 5 players on the entire roster that they drafted in the first. They've only had 5 first-round picks under Pete Carroll and John Schneider. They only have 2 players on the entire roster that they drafted in the first round. Jermaine Ifedi was 31, so he's barely in the first round. The only player on the team right now that the Seahawks drafted in the top 30 is Earl Thomas, and he missed the last 7 games. So they built this whole thing without first-round picks. It's interesting how much of a reliance people seem to have on, well, who's your first round pick going to be? That's never been the thing that makes the Seahawks strong. It's always been what they do on day 2 and day 3. When you look at, getting guys like Bobby Wagner in the second round, Jaron Reed in the second round, Golden Tate in the second round, Frank Clark in the second round. Now Justin Britt, they're starting center in the second round. Tyler Lockett in the third round. Obviously we could go on and on, but they build their team in the second and third and fourth and fifth rounds. I don't think they have got a ton in the 6th and 7th round, but you do have Byron Maxwell and Jeremy Lane, Spencer Ware working out for somebody else right now. It's pretty much going to be that middle part that's going to be what makes the Seahawks. And unfortunately, in another, twist to that is you pretty much only get these great tackles in the top 20. And there are exceptions, of course, but it's very much not where you focus. You don't hone in your focus on how the Seahawks are going to improve at left tackle with the 26th overall pick. It's just not how it works. We saw that last year with Jermaine Ifedi, who, on this podcast was spoken very highly of, and even then getting Jermaine Ifedi and being the exact type of offensive lineman that they want, a very disappointing rookie season for a lot of fans to see that, he did struggle, and he got beat a lot, and, he's moving over to guard. So when you're sitting there and you look at James Carpenter and picking 25th overall, that's pretty much, I think James Carpenter would be the quintessential tackle that you drafted 25th overall. That's tackle guard. That's pretty much the what you should expect as a good scenario, and the best case scenario being a Pro Bowl tackle or guard. Just realizing that is a 1 in 20 shot. That's not a very high percentage shot, as opposed to drafting a tackle in the top 5. That's where a lot of the multiple Pro Bowl, All Pro, Hall of Fame, or even like just very, very good solid left tackles come from. And you can go ahead and you can talk about the ones that didn't, and that's fine. But really, even if you talked about the ones who didn't, like, say, Jason Peters, the perfect, comp for Jason Peters would be Gary Gilliam. That would be the guy that you said, like, if you're trying to get a Jason Peters, well, you would go the Gary Gilliam route, the guy who transferred from tight end to tackle that has the body. You would go the George Fant route. So they are taking those shots in that way. But what would be your end of season grades for the new offensive linemen, specifically rookies, Jermaine Ifedi and George Fant?
Well, it's very hard to be positive about them. Fant, for the most part, if you sort of looked at him as an undrafted free agent rookie, you could probably pick out about, 5 or 6 plays where he looks really good in a game. And you could say, do you know what? For what you've essentially, if I want to use paid in quote marks for this guy, essentially nothing. You got him as an undrafted free agent. For what the outlay you've actually put on him, which is nothing, you've got a lot out of him. You can see the potential there. He's worth persevering with. The problem is he is an undrafted free agent rookie. So you could also pick out 3 or 4 horrible plays. And what we generally found, and this is the problem, Kenny, with social media. I mean, it's one of the major issues with social media. But in terms of a football situation is that somebody can just take a video of George Fant looking really crappy in 3 or 4 plays, make a video of it, tweet it out, and the impression is this guy stinks. That's not fair. It's not a fair way to judge players. And I think that Fant showed a lot of potential. Is there a lot to work on? Yes, there is. But what do people expect? And as for Jermaine Ifedi, I see a lot of criticism of him. Somebody sent me a message earlier saying, hey, Jermaine Ifedi's not that good after all, and yada, yada, yada. You know what? The Seahawks clearly, we talked about him positively on the podcast. The Seahawks drafted him. The Seahawks know what they're doing. There's a reason why we talked about him positively last year. There's a reason why the Seahawks took him in the first round. He has not looked great. Is it a big surprise? No. Why is that? Because he's playing next to a different guy every week at right tackle pretty much. It was first it was going to be Jamarcus Webb. Then it was Gary Gilliam again. Then it ends up being Bradley Sowell. Then it ends up being Gary Gilliam again. That's not a good thing. Justin Britt's a first-year center. The whole line was so green, and there's so little chemistry between them. And some of these guys have never played in the NFL before. To sort of expect, this is like the perfect storm for a disastrous offensive line. And when I see, people grading them or, Pro Football Focus saying, oh, what a terrible line and what a joke, and the Seahawks are a laughing stock because of this offensive line, they've not spent enough money. I kind of feel like, well, who should they have drafted? Which rookies out there a year ago, considering the spots they were drafting in, would have helped them avoid this kind of situation this year? And nobody can answer that. And the second thing is, who would they have signed in free agency? Who was sat there, who was going to, and Okung coming back wasn't likely. J.R. Sweezy didn't play a single down last year. This is not a situation that the Seahawks, I think, have encouraged. I think they've kind of been forced into this, and it's a shame. But the hope is that they can keep adding to this, keep adding to the competition. They can keep trying to develop these guys who have got a lot of physical potential, and that, over time they can grow into something. And I've seen a lot of praise this week about Pittsburgh's offensive line. And while they've got a Pouncey brother in there, and they've got David DeCastro, 2 first-round picks, they've also got 3 guys who have come from the similar background that George Fant's come from, and Mark Glowinski has come from. These are kind of late-round, undrafted free agent guys. And Pittsburgh didn't have a great offensive line when they made the Super Bowl in 2010. Neither Green Bay or Pittsburgh had a good offensive line in that Super Bowl. Everybody was criticizing the offensive lines of Green Bay and Pittsburgh, and yet here we are 6 years down the line, and everybody's praising the offensive line of Pittsburgh and the offensive line of Green Bay. These are 2 of the best pass-protecting teams in the league. It's taken time for them to get there. And I hate to say it, but it might take the Seahawks 3 or 4 years to get to a point where they have a really, really good offensive line. That's the way it's going to be. And if fans think there's a quick fix there ain't. And unless they're going to pick in the top 10 or 15 every year, like Tennessee. The Tennessee Titans this year had 3 top 12 picks on their offensive line. Is it any wonder that they performed well? The Dallas Cowboys were able to pick twice in the top 15 and happened to pick there in the years that, Tyrone Smith and Zach Martin were available. It's not that these teams have done things differently and the Seahawks could have replicated this. The Seahawks have been dealt the hand that they've got. They've had to take players in ranges that are perhaps a little bit undesirable, but they've done what they can, essentially. And unfortunately, they're just going to have to see this one through. Like I said, I do expect they're going to do something. They're going to look at free agency and see if there's options there. They're going to look in this draft. It might be that if Garrett Bowles is there from Utah in the first round, that they take him and they plug him in at right tackle and spend another first-round pick on the offensive line. That's entirely possible if he's available. But I struggle to sort of blend in with all the hand-wringing that goes on about the offensive line, because I think you have to sort of look at it more than just, they've not spent enough. They've not spent enough focus on the offensive line. They've gone cheap, because I think that's kind of like, it's not really being honest with the situation.
Well, speaking of Bowles, and we've talked a lot about the dearth of good offensive linemen in this draft. It's one of the biggest weaknesses, if not the biggest weakness of the draft. And if Bowles is as good as you say, it seems hard for me to believe that after everything we go through, he'll be available after the top 10 because teams will know that they aren't going to get a tackle in the second round if they wait. If you're sitting there at 8, and when they also can look at Jack Conklin for the Tennessee Titans and say, man, that guy made the Titans offensive line the best in the NFL, and they rolled, and they were for a while, and they look like a team that is going to be really good because they have Luan and Conklin. And then you can also look around. I mean, so many teams are going to be doing their best to repeat what the Cowboys did. And so it's going to be, there's so much talk about how good that was for the Cowboys to get their offensive line. We already knew that offensive line were important, but now it's going to be like, oh, maybe we can just go, center, guard, tackle, and just make this offensive line really good, especially when the Titans did that same thing. First round pick, just throwing them out there. So in a year, even when it's not a strong draft or class for offensive linemen, it could still be one where they force it anyway, in the way that you'll see teams force a quarterback in the first round, or a wide receiver or a running back. In Walter Football's latest mock draft, since this is a mock draft podcast, he has the Seahawks taking Garrett Bowles, and he has Bowles being the third off of the board after Ryan Ramczyk from Wisconsin, who he has the Denver Broncos taking at 20th, and Cam Robinson of Alabama, who he has going 9th overall to the Cincinnati Bengals. And what are your opinions on that order, Robinson, Ramczyk, Bowles? And is that something that you see everyone else doing and you agree or disagree? Or is it something, do you think that that's just unique to this situation?
No, I think a lot of people are overrating Cam Robinson at Alabama. I mean, he has the size and the sort of physical attitude, and he's a tough guy, and I can see why people like that. But technically there are a lot of issues. He's quite heavy-footed. I think that he's strictly going to end up playing right tackle, maybe moving inside. It reminds me a lot of the offensive linemen we've seen coming out of Alabama, especially, and there's the kind of long list of similar players. You think of the Quanjo brothers, you think of James Carpenter, now we've got Cam Robinson. They're all of a sort of a similar mold. And yeah, you know what? Getting off the bus, they're going to look really impressive, but they get out on the field and they are not, these kind of dancing bears that people are looking for. So I think that Cam Robinson's probably going to go at the top end of round 2. I think that's kind of the range where he is best suited. For me, Garrett Bowles is the best defensive tackle in college football. And, I think there's every chance, Kenny, that he could be sort of Eric Fisher this year. If you remember, Eric Fisher kind of went from someone who might sneak into the back end of round 1 to being the first overall pick. Now, I don't think Bowles will be the first overall pick. And the thing that Bowles has not got on his side is he hasn't got 3 years of experience playing in college football. He has 1 year because he was in the JUCO ranks, and then he went to Utah for a single season. He hasn't got a lot of experience in college. He is going to be 25 in May, so you're going to be drafting a player in his mid-20s. So you might be looking at him as a sort of a 4 or 5 year prospect initially. Maybe you can get 6 or 7 years out of him before he will start to physically regress. So that's going to maybe put some teams off. But in terms of the talent, as you say, teams want offensive tackles. There is going to be every chance that he goes in sort of that top 15 range. I think the latest he will end up going is number 20 to Denver. They really need offensive line help. So I think there's a good chance that could be his floor, 20 and Denver. I think he's the best. Just the way, there's just little things, Kenny. If people watch him, I don't think I've ever seen a better offensive tackle can level. His ability to sort of, give a jolt to his guy at the initial point of contact, and then sort of progress to the second level, and then bury a linebacker or a safety. Some of the runs that Joe Williams had for Utah are purely because Bowles was able to get out there. His ability to pull, fantastic. He will engage, and his hips are fantastic. Such loose hips for a guy of his size to then turn his guy and open up a running lane. I mean, there is just so many things to like about him. His backstory is incredible. The adversity that he's gone through, the way that he's turned his life around. I think teams are going to love that about him. Now, there's always a chance that these older prospects last a little bit longer. So I'm not going to completely rule out that he's going to last to the Seahawks at 26. I think if he is there at 26, he could easily be their guy. But I do think he's going to go in the top 20. As for Ryan Ramczyk, I mean, I've watched him a lot. He's a really solid player, But whereas you kind of watch bowls and you're like, oh, you like see a play and you get out of your seat a little bit and you get excited. You don't see that with Ramczyk. He's just solid. And the problem we're going to have with him is I think it's really hard to judge just how athletic he is. And he's going to have, I think it's shoulder surgery that he's having, and it's going to keep him out for 4 months. So he's probably not going to be at the combine. He's probably not going to do a workout until the very last minute, if one at all. So it's going to be hard to sort of compare him to, the other offensive tackles we've seen coming into the league in recent years. So all you've got is the tape. And I sort of want to know more about his physical profile before I place him in this draft. So I'm having a hard time doing that. I know that some people prefer him to Garrett Bowles, but I'm a Bowles guy. I think he's got every chance to go in the top 15.
And I don't know if is there any buzz or anybody that you've been tracking maybe for the last couple of years or year or two that's going to be a day 3 pick or an undrafted free agent, whether it was because of an injury or, they're 25 years old or they're converted from another position or, academically ineligible and they went to a junior college or something like that. Any of those guys that seem to have high upsides that will not cost very much?
It's very hard to say at this point. I mean, the best thing to do is to sort of see how the combine goes and sort of look at the pro days that are going to take place, because there's going to be prospects that are not obvious to sort of the draft media or to us as observers of college football, that maybe even some people in the league who are going to get invited to these events, they're going to have an incredible workout. I mean, like people like George Fant. I mean, a year ago, who was talking about George Fant? We ended up talking about him on Seahawks Draft Blog because news got out of this amazing workout that he had. And we started to sort of project him as a potential, undrafted free agent option. The Seahawks, we kind of know enough about the Seahawks now. We know the players that they like. We know of sort of the physical profile that they like. So, we're going to go through pro days, we're going to go through the combine, and some of these players are going to become more apparent. I mean, there are players, the sort of smaller school players, someone like Julian Davenport, who is a small school left tackle. He's the kind of player that maybe will emerge over time. Hassan Reddick is a player I've talked about an awful lot at Temple. It was a walk-on at Temple. He's going to have a crazy combine. He looks like a Bruce Irvin clone. And when Pete Carroll said they were looking for linebacker help and competition the other day, immediately I thought to Hassan Reddick, as somebody that they might look at here. So, and that's going to be a position we need to focus on as well, because we know they like athleticism at linebacker. We know the types of athlete they want on defense. Are there going to be some of these linebackers that are available on day 3 that they can get in there and, add to the competition? They clearly want better depth behind Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright. I don't think they were comfortable with a situation where, Mike Morgan got injured. They tried KPL, Kevin P.L. Lewis at the sort of Sam position and didn't really work. They tried Brock Coyle there, didn't really work. Mike Morgan, as loyal a servant as he has been to Pete Carroll, is a replacement level player. So I think they're going to look for guys like that. So that's kind of maybe a position where we can look at maybe it's JUCO players or players who've got some who've had some issues, who are going to be options for them. And Thomas Rawls was one of those players. He left Michigan, went to Central Michigan, was undrafted. Had some perceived character flags, but the Seahawks really like him, and I think we can see that he is quite a high character guy now. So I'm sure that running back could be another position where they look to add another guy like that.
I'm going to get to the Seahawks draft needs, and as well as just overall what their needs are, and with regards to whether they should go the free agent route or leave it as is, or the draft route, and where they would be looking for the draft. But I do quickly just want to go off topic, because the first thing that I was looking at was just quarterbacks, and you can look at, we know that Russell Wilson has got them set there at the starter position. Trevone Boykin, I think that he has shown enough to, retain that job and at the very least, at the very most, bring in another 2 guys to really compete and see what happens there. But unless someone is just there in the second round that they just can't understand why he's there and they just got to have him, which I think is the right thing to do, then they won't draft a quarterback unless it's on day 3 or something like that. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this quarterback class right now, because, it seems to be all over the place. And it seems to be, whether or not there should be 2 guys at the top, 5 guys in the entire first round, no guys in the first round. Looking at Walter's mock draft here, they've got Deshaun Kaiser going 2nd overall. They've got Mitch Trubisky going 6th overall. Then they've got Pat Mahomes from Texas Tech going 10th overall. And then they've got Deshaun Watson going 23rd overall to the New York Giants. So they've got more quarterbacks in the first round than I had ever thought after talking on this podcast, and especially Mahomes. And it seems like a lot of these guys are up and down. What are your thoughts on the quarterback class in the first round here? How many will go? Who will go first? Who will be the biggest mistake? And maybe who will be like a guy that's going to be a pretty good, 4th round pick?
Well, I don't think it's an atrocious quarterback class. I know that the temptation is to overanalyze these quarterbacks every year, and I think since 2012, every quarterback class has been described as horrendous, and yet you kind of find guys, like Derek Carr's emerged. He was a 2nd round pick, and we all sit here now and wonder how the hell he was not in the top 10. So you can find guys, and I think there are players in this class, Kenny, that could end up being franchise quarterbacks. I think that Deshaun Watson has got star quality. I know we've talked about him an awful lot. Does he have issues? Yes. He also has a major production. He's a proven winner. He won the championship and led Clemson, and he led Clemson, by the way, against possibly the greatest defense we've ever seen in college football, with that loaded Alabama defense that is full of 1st and 2nd round picks. And he just looked pretty flawless towards the end of that game in leading Clemson to the victory. So I think that Deshaun Watson has got a really good chance to have a nice career. I really like Mitch Trubisky. I just think there's just something about him. And you watch him in the Stanford game, in the bowl game, towards the end. I think it was the Sun Bowl that they were in. You watch him in that one, and just his ability to extend plays, his accuracy, he just throws a really nice ball. He did have the pick 6 in that game, but he bounced back straight away from that. I've been impressed with him all year. I think the only really bad game he had was against Virginia Tech, which was in it was in the hurricane. Was it Hurricane Matthew? Was it? I think that was just finished, and the weather was awful. He didn't have a great game against NC State, which was a little bit concerning. But his rest of his resume was really good. I think that Mitch Trubisky's got a really good chance to have a nice career. Deshaun Kaiser has got a lot of things that people are going to look for. Great personality, great character. Can definitely see teams liking the way he conducts himself. The problem with him is Notre Dame started the year with him splitting snaps with Malik Zaire, who is not going to be an NFL quarterback. Why did he not separate himself from Malik Zaire going into the season? Why was he taking a series and then Zaire taking a series? At one point, I think he was sat because he wasn't playing particularly well, and Zaire came in. You watch games like, I think it was the Duke game, where I think he had 2 or 3 interceptions, and some of the throws he was making, Kenny, were just mind-blowingly bad. Decisions were underthrowing guys, inaccurate, just mental mistakes. And yet he's big, strong, got a good arm, can run and extend plays, can be a running threat as well. I think he's maybe more of a project than Deshaun Watson and Mitch Trubisky, but might have the higher upside. So, there are going to be teams who maybe think about taking him in sort of the top 15. And then as you kind of go through the list, I really like Patrick Mahomes at Texas Tech. And I know that his offense is designed to produce major numbers, but he's just got something about him. You kind of watch him and you kind of think, maybe a bit of Tony Romo or something to his game. He's more mobile than you think, throws really, really well on the run. Nice arm, nice downfield throwing, very productive. There is something about Mahomes that I really like. And I think that if he goes in sort of the top of the 2nd round, I think someone might end up getting a really good steal. If I was a team that needed a quarterback that was picking early in round 2, I would seriously think about spending a pick on Patrick Mahomes and just taking a chance on that guy, because there is just something about him. And some team is going to have a go at Brad Kaya. The problem with Brad Kaya at Miami is that he's kind of robotic, and he's not. I think one of the great things about a quarterback needs to be able to sort of create when things aren't there for him. I think he can't just be structured into the offense. If you like that, you're going to end up looking like Alex Smith at his worst. And I think Brad Kaya's a little bit like that. You know, he kind of takes what the play call tells him to take, whereas you kind of want someone who can create stuff. And Brad Kaya can't really do that. But he's been kind of he's the kind of guy who's been destined to be a quarterback since he's about 5 years old. Like, I think his dad's a coach and he's kind of bringing him up to be this certain type of player. And he's, like I say, he's almost a little bit too robotic. You kind of want to see him throw off the shackles a little bit. Clearly felt that he couldn't do anything more at Miami, or that his stock was not going to progress there. He was declared for the draft, despite a lot of people thinking he would come back to the Hurricanes. I think that Kaya's probably looking at a second or third round grade. But that could rise because the league needs quarterbacks, and it only takes one coach or one GM to think, I can work with this guy, and he ends up going a lot earlier. So, you know, there's a collection of prospects there, Kenny. You know, it's not often that you can talk about 5 guys possibly going in the first 2 rounds, and yet here we have it here. So I'm not going to hammer this quarterback class. It's not as good as, you know, there isn't an Andrew Luck in there, but certainly there's a lot to work with.
And speaking of like something where the Seahawks will have no involvement, I'm just curious your thought. How soon, how many days before the draft, or weeks, or whatever, or will we know it all? Will it be before we know who the first pick will be? Do we know it now? Will we know it a week before will it get settled in? Or will it be, we'll find out when Roger Goodell says it, and who will that guy be?
I think it's open for the time being. It could be quite simple and just be Myles Garrett, who I think a lot of people are presuming is the best player in the draft. Cleveland could decide that they're going to continue without a quarterback, or without drafting a quarterback early again this year, and might just decide they're going to build around defense. You know, they could easily go Myles Garrett 1 and then take a safety or a cornerback or linebacker at number 12 and decide that's the direction they want to take. So it could easily be Myles Garrett. Equally, they might convince themselves that there's a quarterback in this class who they have to take. And, you know, I could easily see them being smitten with Deshaun Watson. I could see them liking Mitch Trubisky. I could see them liking Deshaun Kaiser. So I would think that the good money at the moment is on one of Myles Garrett or the 3 quarterbacks. And I think we'll find out probably, we'll have an indication, I think, you know, before the draft. I don't think it's going to be a big secret. You know, because there are people in Cleveland, Hugh Jackson, who are very close to members of the media, I think we'll know what they're going to do in good time.
Okay, so going back to the Seahawks draft needs, let's go quickly to running back, where I think if you're looking ahead to 2017, which of course we are now, you've got Thomas Rawls, who will have, you know, the next 8 months to hopefully, you know, continue to be healthy, and it'll be his first, you know, off season as a guy who gets to, you know, go into any sort of mini camp, workout, training camp as the lead running back, get those reps, you know, not be injured, not be, you know, the number 5 guy on the depth chart working his way up as he was in 2015. This is going to be Thomas Rawls' season. CJ Prosise should be good to go way before any sort of mini camp. So CJ Prosise can hopefully, you know, stay healthy, and he'll get all of that time. And then they've got Alex Collins and and then, you know, working in some of those other running backs. How big of a need do you see running back, and where do you think that they will go with that direction?
Well, I think they need to add a running back at some point, purely because of the injuries. You know, Thomas Rawls has not proven that he can stay healthy. CJ Prosise has proven he can't stay healthy, you know, in his first year in the league. And the depth behind that is essentially Alex Collins. So, you know, if nothing else, they need to replace Christian Michael in the competition stakes. So I think that there's going to be a running back added at some point. It could be a veteran. You know, they're going to be veteran running backs on the open market. You know, they might have a look at some of those guys and see if they want to bring one in. I certainly think that, you know, a more physical, bigger running back could be added at some point. There are going to be options in the draft. It's quite. I think the best way to describe the running back class this year is that it's quite a deep list of mostly average running backs. And, aside from Leonard Fournette and Dalvin Cook at the top, and, maybe one or two others that are going to go quite early, Christian McCaffrey, a lot of people like Deontay Foreman. Apart from that, it's a pretty average bunch. There's a lot of unspectacular running backs who are probably going to go between rounds 3 and 7. In fact, I think a lot of these guys that a lot of people talk about on the blogs. I see it on social media. A lot of people talking about this running back. I think a lot of them are going to go a lot later than people realize because there's just not a lot of excitement amongst this class. It'll be interesting to see where Joe Mixon goes, if at all, or if he's undrafted. And the other name that's kind of popped up is Alvin Kamara at Tennessee, who is a really good player. Has sort of struggled for health a little bit in his career, but was a 5-star recruit. Was formerly with Alabama, but couldn't break their insane depth charts. Went to play in the JUCOs, then went to Tennessee. And if anybody saw the Texas A&M game last year for Tennessee, then they will know how good Alvin Kamara is, and he's got a chance to go in the first 2 rounds. Apart from that, I don't see the Seahawks taking one early. I do think they will add one, though. I think they have to. The other thing worth noting on the running backs is that Carroll admitted some concern with Procise that he's getting too injured, that he has not proven he can stay healthy, that he's had numerous little nicks and injuries and stuff like that. And I think that one of the keys for him is to get stronger and bigger in this offseason, because he does not look like, I think he's listed at like 220 or something like that. He does not look 220. He looks like a receiver who is at running back. And in some ways that's good because it means he's kind of sudden and quick and shifty. But if he's going to run it up the middle and stuff like that, and if he's going to take the punishment of a running back in the NFL, he's going to have to be sturdier. The other thing is Carroll was not overly concerned about the injuries to Thomas Rawls, which was interesting because he's had a broken leg and a broken ankle, and he's been banged up a little bit this year. And yet Carroll was kind of just asserting that these were incidental injuries, that there's not a great deal you can do about a broken ankle, and the broken leg was a bit of a freak injury. So I don't think they're worried about his durability, and I suspect that they believe that Thomas Rawls can still be a star in the league, as we all thought he might be this year. I think obviously it's good that he's ended the year healthy. Hopefully he can come back, have a good off-season, and maybe be the player that we all hoped he could have been this year.
Do you think there's what do you think the future is there with Marcel Reese? Did you really like what you saw to the point of, that's a guy they should try and bring back? Was there any sort of talk on that interested you?
Well, I thought he played well, Kenny. I'm sure that most people would say that he played quite well. The thing is he's a fullback, and the Seahawks have never rushed to re-sign, aging fullbacks. Will Tukuafu basically was the kind of guy that they would sign 2 weeks into training camp or something like that. Or just before training camp. They've been looking for a younger fullback for some time now. There's Cotton on the injured reserve, always seems to be injured. They've tried to sort of get him involved. I think they rate him quite highly. It wouldn't be a surprise if they, had some undrafted free agent running back who's quite big and athletic come in, try out to be a fullback. They've had a look at defensive linemen who are really athletic and tried them at defensive at fullback as well. It wouldn't be a surprise if they drafted someone late in the draft who was, a fullback project, if you want. They've drafted a fullback recently. The guy who ended up at Baltimore.
Kiro Small.
That's it. Yeah, they drafted him in the 7th round not too long ago. So I won't be surprised if we see a draft pick go there. But if none of that happens, if the opportunity doesn't arise, to get a cheap fullback in at some point, if nobody emerges during training in the early stages of training camp, then certainly they might bring back Marcel Reese. It really comes down to 2 things. His desire to continue playing, the other offers that he might get in free agency, and how much money have they got left to spend, and do they want to spend probably a veteran minimum contract on a fullback, or would they rather save money?
Moving over to the wide receivers, you've got Doug Baldwin, one of the best in the NFL. You've got Tyler Lockett, who is recovering from a broken leg, and the hope being that that all heals up nicely. You've got Jermaine Kearse, who draws the ire of a lot of fans, but the fact of the matter is with his contract, there's not going to be any benefit to releasing him. And I think that he's still got the trust of the coaches as a blocker and an option out there, that they aren't going to be parting ways with Jermaine Kearse, unless it is a bit of a surprise. They've got Paul Richardson, who really came on strong at the end of the season, who I think everybody would like to see, a lot of. And Kearse is 26, Richardson is 24, Tyler Lockett is 24. They've got Tanner McAvoy, who's 23 and had some really nice plays, and maybe he can be this maybe big receiver that they've been looking for a long time, 6'6", 230 pounds. And then there's just, some of the other guys like Case Williams. But, the focus really being on Baldwin, Kearse, Richardson, Lockett, and McAvoy. It seems crowded, in terms of spending a high draft pick on a receiver. But, what are your thoughts there?
I don't think it's going to be an early round thing. I mean, I think we kind of know what the Seahawks are going to. I think we know that the Seahawks are going to spend a lot of attention early in the draft on the secondary. I think we know that they are going to keep their options open at linebacker. I mentioned Hassan Reddick from Temple. I think certainly he's somebody we could see in the first 3 rounds. And I think they're going to look at the offensive line. I think they're the 3 positions they will look at early. I think receiver is the kind of thing that if they move down at some point and acquired a 4th round pick, then that's kind of a good range for receiver this year. It might be a 5th, 6th, 7th round pick. I could see them looking at, they've had success with undrafted free agent guys, adding to the competition. Would they look at someone like Speedy Noyle, who had an incredible Nike Spark Combine in 2013? He absolutely lit it up. I mean, it was incredible. So, he's a Texas A&M guy. Is that someone that they would maybe consider as an undrafted guy? There is Pettis at Washington, who you could imagine them sort of looking at in either the later rounds or undrafted free agency. If we're talking about sort of that round 4 range, Joe Chesson is someone I've talked about a lot. Kenny from Michigan, is he somebody that they would have a look at potentially? I think so, because his blocking's really good in the run game. He is a dynamic athlete. He's got some return qualities. I think if you're talking about the best all-round receiver who is also a pretty good athlete, that's Joe Chesson. And I've seen suggestions that he could sort of go in that 4th round range. Didn't have an amazing 2016. Michigan don't use the receivers that much. They're a run first team, like to highlight the tight ends. So I think that Joe Chesson still, for me, is somebody that we should keep an eye on day 3.
Tight end, Jimmy Graham is, eating up a lot of the cap space, but, for a good reason. Nick Vannett is a guy that they just drafted. Brandon Williams was a guy that they really liked and stuck around for the whole season, and was active over Vannett. And then Luke Wilson is going to be a free agent. When I look at free agency in the tight end position, especially for guys who are these athletic tight ends, and the blocking has improved a lot for Luke Wilson. And you look at a guy like Dwayne Allen, who, like Wilson, went into free agency on a season in which he had fewer than 150 yards and only, one touchdown, and, went out and got a $30 million deal from the Colts. His buddy, Kobe Fleener, got a similar deal from the New Orleans Saints. Tight ends and athletic ones are getting paid a ton of money. And so I don't think Luke Wilson could be brought back. There's a reason, Pete Carroll mentioning that they tried to get an extension done with Wilson during the season and couldn't make it happen. And I think the reason for that is that they weren't willing. I think that his agent, and they understand that what his value is, even if he hasn't been productive on the Seahawks. Seattle probably trying to get a discount to stay and just say, don't test the market. You're not playing that much. And so Luke Wilson, I don't see him coming back. And it still leaves them with 3 tight ends, which is, the normal amount of tight ends to have on a roster. And then one of them they just took in the 3rd round. Jimmy Graham is one of the best in the NFL. Brandon Williams. But, it's something also where you want to be careful with those injuries. Vannett was injured at a time this year. Jimmy Graham, of course, coming back from a significant injury. How hard do you think they have to look at tight ends in the draft or free agency?
Well, there are some nice tight ends in the draft, that's for sure. I just think they have so many other needs. When you've got Jimmy Graham on the roster, it's hard to sort of justify, considering another big sort of investment at tight end. Looking at some of the guys who are going to be free agents, Martellus Bennett is due to be a free agent. Jared Cook, who's had a decent sort of second half of the year in Green Bay. There are players that maybe teams will consider that, and it is a nice draft for tight ends. So I think the Luke Wilson situation is going to be quite fluid. I think it's best for him to test free agency, and I think it's best for the Seahawks to allow him to test free agency, because then he can go and establish his value. If he's going to be offered Vance McDonald and money, then obviously he's not going to be coming back to Seattle. But if it's a case of, a $2-3 million deal because teams are not interested in signing him to a big contract, then I could see him coming back. Certainly he has talked about wanting to come back. So if he doesn't get a big offer, I could definitely see him back in Seattle. I have no issue with that. A bit of depth at tight end. Teams seem to like him. Has done a good job for the Seahawks in the past, even if this year was a bit hit and miss for him, really, more miss than hit, actually. So I could see him back, but it's hard to judge at this moment. And I don't see the Seahawks investing an early pick at tight end. I think if they have to go into next year with Jimmy Graham as the number one, Nick Vannett as the number two, and either Graham coming back or Williams coming back rather, or another tight end being added at some point, whether it's later in the draft or free agency or undrafted free agency. I think they'd be pretty comfortable with that situation overall. So I don't think it's going to be a priority in this draft.
Moving over to the other side of the ball, we might as well just start with cornerbacks, because Richard Sherman was playing. It's another revelation that came out after the season was this thing with Richard Sherman's sprained MCL, and Pete Carroll, the NFL looking into it because Pete Carroll never mentioned a sprained MCL, and it was supposedly for like the second half of the year, and it's something that he has to deal with. And Richard Sherman, having a very frustrating season, I think, in terms of his relationship with the media and maybe his relationship in that locker room and what's going on there. And I don't know if any bombshells are going to be coming out this offseason in terms of, is Richard Sherman going to be traded, or, are there going to be any changes there? I think, it's so hard to find a player of Richard Sherman's caliber that, I can't imagine that we're going to be talking about anything other than Richard Sherman, being, a cornerback for the Seahawks for a very long time. On the other side of that is Deshaun Shedd, who, it appears that he has, injured himself so severely that, you have to think that maybe his next season is in doubt. Some cryptic messages there in terms of how bad that injury was for Deshaun Shedd, suffered against the Falcons. But it looks like they can't go into, training camp thinking that Shedd is going to be a starting cornerback. Could be not just a long recovery time, but, it could take until 2018 for him to really be able to, play like he was playing this season and before, just because of how long it might take to gain speed again and catch up to the speed of the game again and everything like that. So, problems there at outside cornerback. And then Jeremy Lane, just having a very rough season, didn't fulfill a lot of the hope, I think, that the fans and the team had when they gave him, a 4-year deal, because, for me, it wasn't a good idea, because when you really looked at it, he had hardly played any football at all through 4 seasons, and now he plays a bunch, and it's like, okay, there's some issues here. And not only that, but this guy's kind of a hothead and he can't control his temper, and, he could cost the team a game at some point with, a dumb penalty. And then you've got DeAndre Elliott, the undrafted free agent, who had a very nice camp and was somewhat of a surprise to make the final roster, I guess, but did make it. And then some other guys that maybe they're working with in terms of depth there, but nothing like of huge note. And now you've got this thing with Shedd and Lane and Sherman and Elliott. So the Seahawks have never drafted a cornerback higher than the 4th round. I'm talking about the Seahawks as we know them today with John Schneider and Pete Carroll. The highest that they've ever drafted one is Walter Thurmond, and they've been getting away with that, Rob. But do you see them changing their philosophy because of the way things are right now, or sticking with it and, finding a cornerback that may, be underrated right now?
I think it's going to be so interesting to see what they do. And since the Atlanta game, Kenny, I've kind of just throw myself into watching defensive backs for 2 days. And I'm glad I did that because Pete Carroll kind of quite openly asserted that that's going to be a big need area for them this year. So I've watched most of the high-ranking cornerbacks. I've seen some of the other guys who are possible targets on day 3 as well, and I like the look of the class. There's a lot of depth there. You just asked, is it something they're going to consider, taking one earlier as opposed to just sort of looking at, the day 3 like they have in the past? I think it depends. It depends because when they come to that first pick at number 26, if Garrett Bowles isn't there, if someone like Zach Cunningham isn't there, they're going to have to consider quite a wide variety of defensive backs because there are so many. Now, one player that I absolutely love is, and I'm sure a lot of people will do, is Buda Baker at Washington. And the more I've watched him, the more that I think he is kind of a Tyrann Mathieu type player. He is a free safety, but the way that he lines up for Washington is quite interesting because he plays in space. He can be a single high safety. He can work as a slot cornerback as well, but it's him sort of just lining up in space, read, react, fly to the ball. He can cover a guy. He can sort of run to the running back, make a big hit. His blitzing is superb, gets into the backfield and makes plays. He's just a dynamic playmaker and so many assets and so much physicality and so much athleticism. And he plays with a Seahawks personality. I could see them absolutely loving Buda Baker. Now, he's probably not going to have 32-inch arms, but I think because he's not an outside cornerback, I don't think it's going to matter. I can't remember what Earl Thomas's arm length was, but is it 32-inch arms? I don't know. But it's not really that important when he's playing in a more sort of central position. And with Buda Baker, I can't imagine that they wouldn't be interested in him. So I think that he's the kind of option. Adoree Jackson at USC could be another player in that kind of mold who they consider for that kind of job. So again, the arm length is not going to be that much of an issue. And yes, they haven't taken a cornerback in round 1, but we're not talking about pure cornerbacks here. We're talking about, dynamic, intensely athletic, hybrid players who you could play in pretty much any down and distance. So I think that that's kind of one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is if they are going to take an outside cornerback, I think it has to be someone truly special. It has to be a special player. I don't think they're going to take a decent cornerback in round 1. That's not what they're about. There's a reason why they've avoided cornerbacks in the past in round 1 is because I just don't think they're special enough. And I think if there is a cornerback there who is incredibly athletic and has just got an insane ceiling, then I think they would take them in the first round. And the player that who most represents, a special athlete for me, who could be available in that range, is another Washington player. It's Kevin King. Now, he's 6'3", he's 195 pounds. A lot of people think he's going to be available in round 3 or 4. There is absolutely no chance of that. He is going to be a top 45 pick. There is a pretty decent chance that he's going to be on the Seahawks radar. Just listen to what he did, Kenny, at the 2016 Husky Combine a year ago. He had a 6.40 in the 3-cone. Now, I went and had a look at the combine records, the NFL combine records, and I couldn't find a cornerback who ran a 6.40 ever. He's 6'3" and 190 pounds. The best I could find was like a Buster Skrine, did a 6.53 or something like that. So if Kevin King legitimately can do a 6.40 in the 3-cone, that will be the best one ever on record at the combine. And he's 6'3", 190. He's not like some 5'9" cornerback. This is incredible. He had a 39.5-inch vertical, a 10-10 in the broad, which is the same as Vernon Hargreaves last year, who went in the top 12. He had a short shuttle of 4.02, which was would have been the third best at the combine last year. Again, he's a big cornerback. I mean, this is the athletic profile of the ages, really. And while he only will run a 4.56 probably, kind of the same time as Richard Sherman, his athletic profile is insane. And when you actually watch him on tape, he's physical, he's big, he covers superbly, doesn't get beaten over the top, he contests the ball in the air. He's targeted an awful lot because I think Sidney Jones across him was also a fantastic player and should go in the top 15. Because they only targeted Jones, I think, 48 times last year, King had a lot of attention and he dealt with it so well. What's going to happen in Seattle? Teams are going to avoid Richard Sherman for the most part. They're going to target him. He's already experienced that. I mean, for me, Kevin King is exactly the type of cornerback I think the Seahawks would consider in the first round. So he's somebody to keep an eye on. So, I'm giving you sort of some names here that they might think about. I think Buda Baker, Kevin King, Adoree Jackson, and then you could imagine them sort of taking cornerbacks in round 2, 3 as well if they have to. Cam Sutton, has he got 32-inch arms? If he has, stick him on the list of players that they need to consider. His superb player at Tennessee, Tre'Davious White, that we've talked about. Again, need to see if he's got the arm length. Really, really good player, could potentially find a home in the first round. I could probably list you about 5 or 6 other players, Kenny, that just for me have got great potential for the Seahawks. I just want to give you sort of like 2 or 3 names for day 3 options as well, because if they take Buda Baker in the first round, they're going to have to find a cornerback at some point. So, there are cornerbacks that West Virginia's Rasul Douglas, 6'3", 203 pounds, 8 interceptions this year, 4-star recruit, major athlete, turnover machine. What have the Seahawks not done enough this year? Turn the ball over. Rasul Douglas could be somebody they look at, West Virginia. There's one play against Iowa State where the receiver gets it down the sideline, he's charging down the sideline. Douglas comes from nowhere, catches him up, punches the ball out for a fumble. Amazing turnover. D.D. Westbrook at Oklahoma might be the fastest player in the draft. And then one play, Rasul Douglas comes from nowhere again and almost chases him down. So if D.D. Westbrook runs like a 4.3 or something like that, Douglas is going to be right up there, and he's going to be somebody who could really, really progress up the boards and could go a bit earlier than people are projecting. He's kind of like touted as a 5th, 6th rounder, could go a lot earlier than that. There's a guy called Akella Witherspoon at Colorado, 6'3" again, great length, great range, did an amazing job covering John Ross. This is the kind of thing you want to look for if you're looking for cornerbacks, is go and watch them matched up against a Mike Williams, a John Ross, a Corey Davis, or someone like that. See how they perform. And for this guy to be 6'3", 190 pounds, and stick with John Ross in coverage, John Ross, one of the most dynamic, fastest receivers in college football, is really impressive. Now, Akella Witherspoon needs to improve his tackling, but as a cover corner at that size, really, really good. And there is one other player that I wanted to mention. That's Oregon State's Treston Decoud. He's at the Shrine Game at the moment, so you're going to see a lot of reports about him. 6'2", 203 pounds, cousin of Thomas Decoud. He's got 33-inch arms. They do a measurement at the Shrine Game. He's got 33 1/8 inch arms as well. So watch out for him if he goes to the combine. This is a loaded draft for cornerbacks and secondary players. The Seahawks are going to find some good picks in this one. I'm so excited about this draft class.
Well, speaking of like some of these cornerbacks, the Seahawks drafting 26th overall. I went back just now and just sort of brought up other cornerbacks in recent years who were drafted between, like, say, the middle of the first round and the middle of the second round. That could be, just to give a comparison. You've last year you've got William Jackson, Artie Burns, and Xavier Howard. In 2015, you've got Marcus Peters, Byron Jones, Jalen Collins, Eric Rowe, and Ronald Darby. In 2014, you've got Darqueze Dennard, Jason Verrett, Jimmy Ward, Bradley Roby, LaMarcus Joyner. In 2013, you've got Desmond Trufant, Xavier Rhodes, Darius Slay, Jonathan Banks. It's in 2012, you've got Janoris Jenkins. There's actually some of the best cornerbacks in the NFL are going in this late first round range. Any of those names that I've just mentioned serve as either a caution to, the Seahawks, what sort of player, in terms of how it can go wrong, like a Darqueze Dennard or an Eric Rowe, as opposed to when it can go so right with Marcus Peters and Desmond Trufant. Like, is there anything to look out there for in recent years with that, with the range that the Seahawks are picking in that could be useful to the players that we're looking at right now?
Yeah, I think there certainly is. I mean, Dennard, when he was coming out, I think that the thing that he was most known for is that it was the number of penalties that he picked up in college football and at Michigan State. And with Eric Rowe was very much an athlete first. So you put on his tape and you wouldn't sort of be blown away by it, but you knew that he was such a great athlete. So he was kind of taken on a profile as opposed to what he does. I think one thing that I'm going to try and do, I suspect the Seahawks will do this as well. I mean, if there's one position the Seahawks know, it's cornerback. So first of all, that they've done such a good job finding cornerbacks, and people can say what they want about the 2016 season. This is a team that has consistently found and developed cornerbacks really, really well. So I'm not worried about the way that they judge cornerbacks at all. But one of the things that I'm going to try and look for is not just a physical profile here. I want to see really good cover corners, and I want to see guys that are either making plays on the ball, if not interceptions, but if they can force turnovers as well and have splash plays and impact a game, then even better. And that was one of the great things about watching Kevin King, was that you would watch him and you would sort of see how sticky he is in coverage and would not get beaten over the top. And sometimes, because his deep speed is going to be an issue. He's going to run at the combine, he's going to run in the 4.5s or whatever, or 4.6s, I don't know. And teams are going to be like, he's not as good enough or whatever. And then he's going to do all the other tests and they're going to be explosive as hell. And people are going to just love that side of it, but be put off by the long speed. But Richard Sherman has proven that you don't need to be a 4.3 or a 4.4 guy to be a fantastic cornerback. And this is the kind of thing to look for, So I want to see explosive athleticism. If they've got the speed as well, fantastic. But more than anything, I want to see evidence of really good cover skills and potentially turnover ability as well. And it is, it's like any other position. I really liked D. Milner from Alabama, who bombed at the Jets, and I really liked D. Milner and got that. Yeah, and so did a lot of other people. I mean, he went in the top 10, I think, in the end, or thereabouts. A lot of people like D. Milner, and it hasn't worked out. And that's going to happen as well. I mean, the Seahawks might take Kevin King after everything I've said about him. I mean, he might just not be that good at the next level. There is that aspect to the draft. When you talk about a player being really good or having a lot of potential, it doesn't mean it's going to work out. I mean, when they actually get into the league, you don't know how it's going to be. And this is the thing about the draft. When we talk about prospects, I can highlight a prospect and can say, this guy looks really good, and this guy does this and he does that, and he jumps this high and he runs this fast. When they actually get into the league, just because they do all of those things and just because you rightly highlight them doesn't mean that they're going to be really great at the next level. So, that's something to consider as well. It is quite a bit of a lottery as well.
Well, let's just say, now that we're in a situation where the Seahawks do maybe need to draft a cornerback in the first 2 rounds, and that they could because there's so many guys out there. If Stanley Jean-Baptiste was in this draft and we didn't know anything about, what would transpire with his career, given how he was always compared as, this is the exact mold of Richard Sherman, do you think that he's someone that you would be excited about, or were the knocks on Stanley Jean-Baptiste enough to be like, just because he is so much like Richard Sherman in size, he's just not a very good cornerback?
Well, I liked Jean-Baptiste as, in terms of potential when he was coming out. And the thing about him was he's kind of what I'm talking about with Kevin King, because he had an incredible vertical jump. I'm just looking at his combine here, Kenny. So he had a 41.5 inch vertical, which is insane. That's 2.5 inches or a couple of inches more than Kevin King that I've been talking about. He's 6'3". He's 218 pounds. So that's like 20, 30 pounds heavier than Kevin King. He had the 32.5 inch arms, had an amazing broad jump, but he ran a 4.61. And for some teams, running a 4.61 at cornerback is not going to be acceptable. To the Seahawks, they're not quite as concerned about that. I would have, if he was in this draft and we were looking at him, I'd probably have to go back and look at his tape. At the time, I didn't really spend much time studying Stanley Jean-Baptiste because, going back to that draft, you wouldn't expect the Seahawks to have taken a cornerback early. So I can't tell you much about his cover skills or his ball skills or anything like that. But in terms of a physical profile, yes, you'd be excited. And, if we were talking about him as a potential first rounder or as potential second rounder for the Seahawks, yes, you would have to have tallied him as a as a possibility there. And hopefully, fingers crossed, he can. The Seahawks have seen something in him, and hopefully, I think that wasn't he on injured reserve? Did he get put on injured reserve pretty quickly? Is that correct?
I think that I think that yes, he did, but I don't know if he's still on the roster officially or if they gave him his release with an injury designation. But I mean, if they wanted to bring it back, either he's on the roster or they could just bring it back, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm having a look and I can't quite see whether he finished on injured reserve or not. He's listed on the Seahawks roster as an exclusive rights free agent.
Uh-huh.
So they will have some control over him. So yeah, hopefully he comes back and he's going to be part of this competition. Pete Carroll did make reference to there are some players on the roster already that are gonna have to pull from the. I can't remember exactly the phrase that he used, but he made some reference to there being guys on the roster that they were really excited about that they were going to have to fight.
It's wild. Stanley Jean-Baptiste was a second-round pick. He has played in 4 games and really didn't even play in those games. I mean, it's crazy. He's 3 seasons in. I mean, injured, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's wild how usually a guy, and he was released. So it's not like the whole thing was, by the Saints. So it's not like he was just inactive because he wasn't doing any good. And it's like, it's crazy to have that big of a miss, but he's only 26. He'll be 27 next season. I'm sure that, you should check it out. But yeah, that's one of the biggest, like, never played type, like, high picks right there.
Yeah, and the Saints went through a period of trying to sort of mimic the Seahawks a little bit. They spent big in free agency on a safety. They drafted a safety in the first round. From Texas, they Brandon Brown assigned there. Mm-hmm. They drafted Stanley Jean-Baptiste in the second round. They were trying to copy the Seahawks essentially, and it didn't really work. But there are some guys on the roster who, and I think that's going to be the key here. It's going to be to sort of add competition and have a really, I think they more than anything they just want to go into next season feeling really good about having a really deep secondary, which is what this team has been known for in the past, the 2012, 2013, 2014, loads of depth, loads of competition at cornerback, loads of talent there as well. And I think that is the sort of the main desire. And Jean-Baptiste, he and DeAndre Elliott, who was on the active roster as well towards the end of the year, they could figure into the plans here.
Well, we got to try and get through these other positions here without going over our, another 2-hour podcast. But yeah, cornerback seems like perhaps the most interesting thing right now to focus on, and it'll be interesting to see. And good name to know, Kevin King. Going on to the safeties, you've got Earl Thomas, who at this point, seeing what happened to the Seahawks after Earl Thomas went out, they might as well, just name the stadium after him. Everything needs to go to Earl Thomas, and keeping that, hoping he is healthy, that the leg heals and there's no complications, and, he can get back out there without any fears on the field. Back at free safety, obviously Cam Chancellor, they could be looking at a contract extension for him, but he still is under contract, and, that he's still one of the best safeties in the NFL. And then, some interesting guys like Kelsey McRae, Dewey McDonald, who's cornerback and safety, perhaps in the Deshaun Shedd type role. And then Tyvis Powell, who they waived, but, we'll find out after the Super Bowl whether or not, anyone else picked him up or if he will be able to, come back. You mentioned Budda Baker. So I guess with that and the DBs, whatever else you have to add, feel free to add, and then we'll move on.
Well, it's a really good safety class, Kenny, and I'm as enthusiastic about this as I am with the cornerback. So right at the top of the draft, Malik Hooker looked like another Earl Thomas. Great range. He's probably going to go in the top 10. Jamal Adams at LSU has got a chance to go in the top 10. Jabril Peppers is an interesting one because there's a lot of people out there, and I'm one of those that believe that he could go in the top 10. And then there's people like Daniel Jeremiah from NFL.com who did his top 50 board today and put Jabril Peppers as the 33rd best player in the draft. So all of a sudden I'm thinking, hey, should we consider this guy for the Seahawks? He's extremely athletic. Could he do the kind of role that I've just talked about with Budda Baker? Yes, he could. Could they use him as depth at strong safety as well if Cam Chancellor is going to have these sort of like 3 or 4 games every year where he's injured? Yes, that's definitely a possibility. Could it be a long-term successor to Cam? Yes. So suddenly I feel like I need to go and throw on some Jabril Peppers tape and watch him as well. Buda Baker, I think, is going to go in the top 20. If he's there at 26, I think he's a definite consideration for the Seahawks. Again, a player that can play in space, can play nickel, can play slot, could play just sort of like roaming hybrid, Tyrann Mathieu type, and could also be a backup option for Earl Thomas if he ever gets injured and play free safety. That is, I think what they're going to want to do is have better depth at safety in case the big two go out. And I think if they can have mini Cam and mini Earl on the roster and feel good about the depth they've got there, they will be very happy. They've not had that before. Earl's been very durable, but then it got exposed when he was injured. So I think Buda Baker definitely a target for that reason. I think that one other player that I've spoken about a lot, Kenny, the name will be familiar to you, is Shalom Luani from Washington State. He's got a real spark to him. I think he looks really, really gritty and physical and athletic. I really like the way that he plays, and he's not as big as Cam, but you know what? I really, really like this guy, and I think that as a special teamer, as a backup, as a guy that you put on the field in certain down and distance, as a guy that could probably fill in for Cam if needs be or whatever, I just think that he's going to be, and he's great backstory as well. I just think he's going to be somebody that the Seahawks really show a lot of interest in. So I've been sort of touting him as maybe someone who's going to move up into the sort of 2nd, 3rd, 4th round kind of range, depending on how he works out at the combine. I think he's going to do better at the combine than people expect. And I think that he's going to be somebody the Seahawks really like. We heard a few weeks ago, Pete Carroll says, hey, we've been watching a lot of Washington State recently. And people are sort of saying, well, is he watching the quarterback? Is it the receivers? Who is it? And I think it was Shalom Luani. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he is somebody the Seahawks kind of go into this draft thinking, we want this guy. So I think that he could be somebody to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, and some of the safeties drafted recently in the range I mentioned before, including Demarius Randall, Landon Collins, Deion Buchanan, Eric Reed, and Harrison Smith. So really some of the best as well you can find in that sort of mid to late 1st round range. And moving on to defensive end, again, here's the Seahawks. They have Michael Bennett, and he's just been signed to a contract extension. They have Cliff Averill, who, just had his career high in sacks. They have Frank Clark, who had 10 sacks and was just really dominant. And then Cassius Marsh being a nice role player who isn't going to go anywhere, I think with his special teams ability, and, perhaps they still see some, potential there. But, also as a defensive end, but also, I think Cassius Marsh is going into his final season. So, certainly it's not something that you would ever neglect, being defensive end and pass rush. So what do you see them doing at that point? And is there anybody that could be at the end of the 1st round that they just, would not be able to say no to as a defensive end?
I don't think so. I mean, there's from what Carroll was saying, and every year he's been very honest about what they're looking to do in the off season, and this year specifically talking about safety, linebacker, and offensive line. I think that is going to be the focus. It is a good draft for edge rushers. There's a whole host of those. There were some good defensive linemen as well. I think that Solomon Thomas at Stanford is possibly going to be the first off the board after Myles Garrett. He could easily go in the top 5. He's an insane talent, insane player, Solomon Thomas. I think he's going to go really, really high, a lot higher than people are saying. But then you kind of run through the list. Jonathan Allen's going to go quite early. Taco Charlton will go early. Charles Harris at Missouri will go early. Tim Williams, if the drug issue is not as serious as people are suggesting, could go quite early as well. Derek Barnett at Tennessee is a really fun player to watch and could go quite early. Tack McKinley at UCLA. These are all guys that could go in the 1st round. So there's an awful lot of players there. But Pro Football Focus, I know we've talked about them in the past, Kenny, not always positively, but they've done a study today, and they ranked the front 7s in the NFL, and the Seahawks were number 1, and they asserted that Seattle's front 7 was the best in the league, and the players they highlighted were obviously Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright, but also the 3 pass rushers, Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill, and Frank Clark, there is a lot of talent there, and it kind of shows that it is the secondary that is the issue. I'm not sure that adding another edge rusher is and just boosting the rotation is the best thing. I think that if there was a really great interior pass rusher in this draft class, then he could have been an option for them, but there isn't. At least not in the range that the Seahawks are going to be picking. So I don't think they're going to take a defensive lineman or an edge rusher early. I think what they're more likely to do is to look at the linebacker position and see, who they can get who's had an impact on plays. I've talked about Hassan Reddick a lot at Temple, and the reason I talk about him a lot is because he had 10.5 sacks last year, 22.5 tackles for a loss, couple of interceptions, forced fumbles. His production was very similar to Bruce Irvin. He looks like Bruce Irvin. He's got the same attitude as Bruce Irvin. He's a similar athlete to Bruce Irvin. He is basically a clone of Bruce Irvin. And I think if they're going to boost the pass rush in the draft, it's going to be with somebody like that. Or they might consider in the first round Zach Cunningham, who had 16.5 tackles for a loss at Vanderbilt. Not many sacks, but a lot of tackles for loss. Great player who gets into the backfield, make plays there. That's the kind of player that I think they'll consider in the draft. I think if they do anything on the defensive line, Kenny, it's going to be in free agency. They've had a lot of success bringing in veteran defensive linemen in the past. You can run through the long list, of course, but it would not surprise me whatsoever if the Seahawks make a tilt at Calais Campbell to play that interior, to be just a stout monster in the middle and just finish off this defensive line and make it incredibly intimidating going into next year.
So would you say that previewing your next, 10 versions of the mock draft or whatever, however many mock drafts you're going to release between now and, draft day, would you say that it's just going to be a tackle, a cornerback, a linebacker, and maybe a safety? Do you see yourself going any other direction besides those four?
Free agency could change that. You just never know what's going to happen. If they address some of those needs in free agency, then of course you have to consider other options. I just think that, that what I try and do is I've always listened to Pete Carroll in his end of season press conference. I sat there and wrote notes down for the third, fourth year in a row because he talks very openly and honestly at the end of the season. It's fascinating. I don't think there's another head coach like Pete when he talks at the end of the year, and he always lays out what they want to do. And, he was almost getting impatient. He wanted someone to ask the question, what are the needs? And he kind of just blurted it out and said, look, what, I'm going to give you something here. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at the secondary, we're looking at the offensive line, and we're looking at younger competition and depth at linebacker. And I'm like, that is just, if I hear that, and his track record is he's so honest with this. At the end of the 2010 season, we want to be better at running the ball. They went and took James Carpenter, who was the best run blocking offensive tackle in college football. They took John Moffitt from Wisconsin. They ran the ball really well. Before the 2012 draft, what are the needs, Pete? We want to get more speed in the front seven. Their first pick was Bruce Irvin. Their second pick was Bobby Wagner, speed in the front seven. They've done everything that whenever Pete is very honest about this. And when he said safety, linebacker, offensive line, picking anything else in the first round at this stage, I think I'd be doing a bad job to do that. So I think at the moment, for the mock draft, if you follow Seahawks draft blog, if you follow the coverage, then certainly expect to see those three positions featured a lot over the next few weeks.
All right, so I think that wraps up the Seahawks draft needs portion of the podcast, and most portions of this podcast are now complete. We should talk briefly about the AFC and NFC championship games. This stuff only happens once a year, and it's a football podcast, and we've been talking about it for so long. I think it's interesting. I wrote an article for Sports on Earth about the importance of quarterbacks, and you look at the Final Four, and you got Tom Brady, Matt Ryan, Aaron Rodgers, and Ben Roethlisberger. You could argue that those are the four best quarterbacks in the NFL. Certainly, Drew Brees and Russell Wilson and Andrew Luck and other guys would like to chime in, but. Yeah, I can't really argue against it. And you go back around, Wilson was there, Dak Prescott was there. There were plenty of great quarterbacks who had made it almost that far. And so it's really interesting. Three of these guys could win MVP, and I don't think you can make a really good argument for why they shouldn't. You could definitely make an argument if when or if Matt Ryan wins MVP, you can certainly say why you think Tom Brady should have won it or why you think Aaron Rodgers should have won it. But I don't think you can argue that Matt Ryan shouldn't have won it. So, whatever it comes down to, these quarterbacks, it's the quarterbacks, show right now. And that's usually what you're going to get. So Aaron Rodgers, the hot streak, the throw to Jared Cook, one of the great plays of all time, and it sets them up to beat the Dallas Cowboys. And then you've got Matt Ryan, who just picked apart the Seahawks defense and, has put up so many, career best numbers, but also just numbers that rarely seen by any quarterback. And he's not doing it with any one, major weapon. As good as Julio Jones is, it's 6 touchdowns for him. So it's really just spreading the ball around as much as possible. And the Falcons get the home game since Dallas lost. And so the Falcons will be at home. And so they want to go to the Super Bowl for, I think, the second time in franchise history and win it for the first time. And so, you've got the Atlanta Falcons as opposed to Green Bay Packers and Aaron Rodgers. Certainly the Falcons didn't have as good of a defense as the one that they showed against the Seahawks, for most of the season. So defensively, they aren't really all there, but the Green Bay Packers don't have a rushing attack really to speak of. Maybe Ty Montgomery could be the breakout player of the game and sort of change the game for them. But what are your thoughts on Falcons, Packers? Who you got there?
Well, I just think that Aaron Rodgers, he is incredible. And I think the thing about Aaron Rodgers is when I was watching the game, I thought, when I'm watching Dak Prescott do everything that he's doing, it's understandable, because if the guy was in the decathlon in the Olympics, it would make sense. He looks like an incredible athlete. Aaron Rodgers kind of looks like if you bumped into him in the supermarket or something, or if he was your postman, it wouldn't be a total surprise. He looks like a postman, Kenny. When he had the mustache for Movember or whatever, he looked like a postman. And yet he's playing on a level which I'm not sure we will ever see again. He is just incredible. The guy is 33 years old. He's like a year older than me. And watching him do what he does at 33 and sort of thinking sometimes when I struggle to get out of bed in the morning when I'm really tired, I just think this is just incredible. And that throw and the way that he was leading that team against Dallas. And, if you took Aaron Rodgers off the Green Bay roster, how many games would they win? And I know it's a pretty easy thing to say, because if you took, Matt Ryan out the Falcons, or if you took Tom Brady out the Patriots or whatever, they'd all suffer as well. But, that he basically is that team. He just drives that thing forward. He is insanely good. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about, the wild card round and stuff like that. And I remember talking about the Packers and the Giants and saying, do you know what? It just feels destined for the Packers. They went into the end of the season on a 6-game winning streak. They've gone on the road and beat New York at home. They've gone on the road to the number 1 seed and beaten them. How do you stop Aaron Rodgers right now? And I suppose that in many ways, Atlanta are the perfect team for them, because for them to face in terms of being beaten, that is, maybe not the perfect team. I phrased that completely wrongly. They are the worst team for them, because they're facing an offense that can go punch for punch with them. I think wasn't the last game something like 33-32. So Ryan's going to score points. Rodgers is going to score points. And it's going to be who scores the most ultimately at the end. So that is going to be a tough match for Green Bay. But Rodgers is just so freaking good. It's hard to bet against him right now. It's hard to think that he's not going to have a little bit more magic in him to get this team to the Super Bowl. And yet, just because it's in Atlanta and just because the Falcons also seem to have a great deal of momentum, I think this is a complete coin flip, impossible to call. And I think we should just all bloody well enjoy it, because it's going to be an incredible example of offensive. I think it's going to be an offensive masterclass, this game.
Yeah, the game between the Packers and Cowboys is considered an instant classic, one of the best playoff games, and I think you could see a return to that this week between the Packers and Falcons, mostly because these quarterbacks are so good and these defenses aren't. So it's like it'll be really interesting to see, how that goes. Similar to the Cowboys and the Packers, where you had these two quarterbacks. I think Dak Prescott has proven himself as a top 10 quarterback in the NFL, and not a lot of defense. And I thought both teams would score at least 30 points, and they did. And I think that's something you're going to see again. I mean, the Atlanta Falcons or the Green Bay Packers, though. I mean, their pass defense is just awful. I mean, they were 31st in passing yards allowed, 29th in passing touchdowns allowed, 30th in net yards per pass attempt allowed, but they got away with it because they were 4th in interceptions. They had 17 interceptions. So you're going to have to be, can they make Matt Ryan make mistakes? He threw 7 interceptions on 534 pass attempts. He didn't make any mistakes against the Seattle Seahawks playing against their defense. Maybe that would have been different with Earl Thomas, because I don't think that the Seahawks had an interception after Earl Thomas got hurt. And so that's kind of crazy. But can Demarius Randall or HaHa Clinton Dix make a play that really makes that will change the game? Because that's going to be, to me, the key is whether or not they can force a turnover on Rodgers, and especially a key one. Because if they can't do that, I think I got to go with the Atlanta Falcons, if only because Matt Ryan is, playing as good as Aaron Rodgers. This whole talk about Aaron Rodgers' hot streak, I believe that Aaron Rodgers is probably the best player in the NFL, and I'm with it. I was watching, I was praising him during the game. Just it's every little thing that he does, because everyone can say, well, he does this, but everybody does, or like a lot of quarterbacks do that. Like the little tricks that he plays with getting the free play touchdowns, and and knowing how many guys are on the field. He's just aware of literally everything. And it's like, yeah, a lot of guys are able to, they know when the free play is coming, but he does all of that stuff. There's nothing that Aaron Rodgers doesn't do, and he can pull off these phenomenal plays to Jared Cook and these weird Hail Marys. Just ask yourself a question. Why does Aaron Rodgers have 13 of those free play touchdowns? Someone put this out there. I think Chris Wessling or someone like that put this out there, where it was like, since a certain date, he has 13 of those free play touchdowns, and nobody else has more than 3. He's got 3 or 4 of those Hail Mary touchdowns, and nobody else has more than, like, the whole rest of the NFL has like 2 in the same period of time. Why? It's not. I believe that Hail Mary stuff, it's crazy. I can't imagine it's not some luck. Why not get some of those? That was bad defense. It's just crazy to me. But there he is anyway, and so he's doing it all the time. That being said, Matt Ryan, Aaron Rodgers has a hot streak. Matt Ryan had a hot year. Everything about it. It all adds up to a 117 passer rating and beating the Seahawks. For that reason, I'm going to go with the Falcons. I think it's a little bit of a surprise because, Atlanta is Atlanta and Green Bay is Green Bay. But I'm going to go with the Falcons, and I'm going to say 37-35 or something like that. With regards to the AFC, I think we're lucky that we don't have to see Kansas City play New England and just sort of go walk right into the Super Bowl for the New England Patriots, because the Chiefs were no match for the Patriots. And Alex Smith is just such a bland quarterback, and he's going to the Pro Bowl, and Andrew Luck is behind him in the Pro Bowl. I don't know how that works, but you've got Ben Roethlisberger, Le'Veon Bell, and Antonio Brown. That probably is the best team in the AFC to give New England a run for their money. What do you think about Ben Brady?
Another classic matchup, Kenny. And, when I've watched Pittsburgh against New England in the past, it's always kind of felt like they need to play the perfect game, which is kind of strange because New England don't have this amazing defense. But the one thing is that New England have kind of bossed Pittsburgh's defense. So what I would expect is Tom Brady and LeGarrette Blount and everything about New England to kind of get theirs. And I don't think Pittsburgh will have much of an answer on defense. I think the key to the game and whether or not Pittsburgh are going to win is whether or not they can get Antonio Brown involved, whether they can get Le'Veon Bell involved. Bill Belichick is a master, because what he does is he will identify the best or most threatening weapon on a team's offense and take them away. If you notice, Jimmy Graham barely had, did he have a catch in the game that when the Seahawks beat New England? I don't think he did. And when Jimmy Graham was with the Saints, I think he had like 1 catch for 3 yards against New England. I mean, Belichick focuses on the offense's best player and takes them away. So what he will try and do, I think, is take Antonio Brown out of the game. And then it could be that Le'Veon Bell has got to have a sensational performance in order for Pittsburgh to win this, or it'll be the other way around. They will try and shut down the run and take their chances on Antonio Brown, which I can't see Bill Belichick being foolish enough to do. So it's going to come down to those two aspects. Maybe Ben making plays with Antonio Brown taken out of it because of coverage, or Le'Veon Bell running productively. I think ultimately what we're going to see is New England win this game, which is kind of predictable and boring. And I kind of hope, I still hold out hope, Kenny, that the Seahawks are going to be the team of the decade. And if New England win 2 Super Bowls and Seattle only wins 1, then it's going to be difficult for the Seahawks to be the team of the decade. So I think, I'm going to be rooting for Pittsburgh, maybe. I know that they haven't won a Super Bowl this decade, but I don't know. I to be honest, I kind of hate all 4 teams that are remaining in the playoffs. So I'm trying to avoid it. I'm trying to think about the draft instead. So I think New England's going to win, but who cares?
Well, I got to say, New England, the 14-2 record, and going 11-1 under Brady, and Brady's 2 interceptions, and everything about it. I mentioned the 3 leading MVP candidates, perhaps, Derek Carr as well wants to be in there. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, if Le'Veon Bell is the true MVP, he will show it on Sunday. There's a guy that had 105 rushing yards per game, 51 yards receiving per game, put up 1,800, almost 1,900 yards from scrimmage in 12 games. I mean, we may be talking about the real best player in the NFL who's not a quarterback. I can't give that title to anyone that's not a quarterback, I don't think ever. Quarterback is just too important. But if Le'Veon Bell goes out there and says, you can put up whatever you want against me, I'm the best player on this field, watch this, and takes over the game, which you think he's capable of doing, and that's going to be a key for Pittsburgh. But another key being, Pittsburgh has themselves won 9 games in a row, and they've won 5 of those games on the road. So they aren't afraid to go on the road, and their defense has allowed, 16 points or less in 5 of those games. And they've forced 2 turnovers or more in 6 of those games. I don't think that Tom Brady is going to get away with no interceptions this week. And I think that I smell the upset coming. I don't think that the New England Patriots are quite as, this is not a year of any dominant team. And I think New England sort of has gotten away with, a fairly easy schedule. They have not had to face a lot of, top tier quarterbacks. They've gotten away with some wins here against the Houston Texans and Brock Osweiler to get to this point. They played the Miami Dolphins with Matt Moore the week before that. They played the Jets the week before that, the Broncos the week before that. 2 weeks before that, it was the Rams. The week before that, it was the Jets. The week before that, it was the 49ers. And then at the same time, the week before that, the Seahawks come in and beat them at their own stadium, 31-24. And I don't think that the Patriots are as good as a team that, if you look back in history and say, oh, look, the Patriots won 14-2. That was the best record. They won the Super Bowl. They must be one of the best teams of all time. Hell no. I don't think that they're that good. I think they could be the best team in the NFL, but I think the gradient from number 1 to number 6 isn't very large. So for that reason, and just because I kind of want it to happen, I'm going to pick the Steelers to win this game 27-20. And I won't be surprised about it. And I don't think anyone else should be surprised about it because Ben Roethlisberger is not Brock Osweiler. So I'm saying Steelers Falcons.
Your sense is I'll go with the complete opposite then, Kenny, and we can rejoin next week and we can see who is right. So I'll go with New England, Green Bay.
Perfect. So there you go. And that's the perfect way to end 3000 NFL mock draft for this week. Come back next week for, another episode. We'll talk about, see who was right. We'll see if there's any, what news stories are going to break about the Seahawks between now and then. I'm sure they've got some nice little, stuff all ready to unwrap about, the media or the locker room or, players and coaches and disputes and everything like that. We'll see it too, because the other thing too is if the Patriots and Falcons, if the Falcons make the Super Bowl, then the San Francisco 49ers have to wait an additional 2 weeks if they want to get Kyle Shanahan to sign off to be their next head coach. Because Josh McDaniels has apparently pulled out of the race because he found out he wasn't the number one choice. Tom Cable pulling out of the race. And you're just going to be looking at, well, what happens? I want to end the podcast so bad. But, Rob, if the Falcons win next week, and what happens to the 49ers if Kyle Shanahan doesn't even want the job and changes his mind, and just had the interview to sort of have the interview? What do the 49ers do at that point? Because it seems like there isn't going to be a good candidate to be their next head coach at that point.
Well, knowing the 49ers as we do, Kenny, they will probably pick up the phone, they'll probably dial a number, and they will say, Jim Mora, we want you to be the San Francisco 49ers head coach. And let's all hope that happens.
Yeah. All right. Well, there you have it. Let's cross our fingers for Jim Mora to be the next 49ers head coach, which will lead to us talking about who the next 49ers head coach will be a year from now after he's gone. That's it for 3000 NFL Mock Draft. This has been this edition. Come back next week for a new draft.